There comes a time in life, not marked by a birthday, a calendar, or a celebration, when something within begins to change. It's not loud. It doesn't arrive like a storm. No one throws you a party or sends you a warning. It happens in silence, in between the lines of everyday life. You notice that you no longer feel like going out. The idea of visiting people, once exciting, once routine, now feels strangely heavy. Not because you don't love them, not because you've grown bitter, but because something deep inside you has shifted. You find peace in your own company. The silence, once unbearable, now feels like an old friend. You sit with your thoughts longer. You remember more clearly. You observe instead of interrupt. You feel the pulse of life not in the noise but in the stillness. And one morning, almost without realizing it, you decline an invitation. You say, "Maybe next week," or "I'm a little tired today." And it's true. You are tired, but not just in your body. There's a kind of soul tiredness that begins to show itself around this time in life. A quiet longing for authenticity, for deeper meaning, for peace that doesn't demand performance. It's not about loneliness. No, it's not that at all. It's about liberation. A subtle, sacred detachment from the superficial things that once consumed your energy. A soft retreat, not from the world but from what no longer nourishes you. The world continues its rush. Phone screens light up, cars hurry by, conversations flow faster than minds can think. But you begin to sit longer at your window. You sip your tea slower. You listen to the birds and feel the texture of time. Some may call it withdrawal, but perhaps it is awakening. A new chapter is opening, one that few recognize but every wise soul eventually reaches. And in this chapter, you are no longer chasing after people. You are returning to yourself. Even a short trip feels like a small expedition. You pause. You plan. You wonder, is it worth the energy? It's not just about distance anymore. A 10-minute walk can feel like a marathon. A staircase becomes a mountain. Even standing too long in the shower feels like a challenge to be negotiated. No one sees it. No one hears the quiet sigh you let out when you bend to tie your shoes, or the sharp sting that shoots through your knee as you rise from a chair. You've learned to hide these things well, because society doesn't slow down for aching joints or fragile hips. It expects you to keep up, smile, push through. But inside, your body whispers truths that can't be ignored anymore. You move differently now, more carefully, more consciously, not out of fear, but out of respect. Respect for the temple that's carried you through storms, births, losses, and victories. Respect for the muscles that once danced and lifted and ran, and now simply ask for rest. You begin to weigh invitations. A dinner party 3 blocks away. That's 3 blocks there, 3 blocks back, and a long evening sitting in a chair too low for comfort. You start to say no more often. Not out of rudeness, but out of wisdom. Because every step now costs something. Not just energy, but recovery. A walk today might mean soreness tomorrow. A late night out might mean an entire day of fatigue. This isn't weakness. It's reality. And slowly the world begins to shrink, not in bitterness but in gentleness. Your home becomes your haven. Your chair becomes your sanctuary. You don't need a crowd to feel complete. You've learned that presence is not defined by proximity. People may wonder why you stopped showing up, why you don't drop by like you used to, but they don't feel what you feel. They don't carry the invisible weight. Still, there's grace in this chapter. Because now, every movement is intentional. Every outing is chosen, not chased. And there's a quiet power in choosing where to place your energy. Not everything deserves your footsteps anymore. There was a time when conversation felt alive. Voices filled rooms like music. Laughter spilled over coffee cups. You didn't notice the time because the company made hours feel like minutes. But something's changed. Not in the words themselves, but in what lies beneath them. Now conversations feel faster but emptier. People speak more but say less. You sit among old friends or even family and find yourself drifting, not because you're tired, but because the topics feel like surface chatter. Weather, politics, the price of groceries, and beneath it all, something in you is whispering, "Where is the soul in all this?" You try to interject something deeper, maybe a reflection, a memory, or a question that reaches the heart. But the moment passes. They're on to the next subject, eyes on their phones, thoughts already elsewhere. And so you fall silent, not out of sadness, not out of resentment, but because silence now speaks more honestly than words. It's not that you've lost your voice. It's that you've gained clarity. You no longer feel the need to fill spaces with noise. You've lived long enough to know that most people only listen to reply, not to understand. And you crave something more now, something richer. You long for conversations that taste like slow-cooked meals, not fast food talk that leaves you hungrier than before. You remember what it was like to talk with someone who looked you in the eyes, who paused, who cared, and that memory makes the current world feel lonely, even in a crowd. So you choose silence, not as escape, but as preservation, because silence doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend to care, it simply is. And in that quiet, you find your truth. You listen more, not to others, but to yourself. And what you hear is beautiful. You begin to realize that some voices are loud but empty, and some silences are full of meaning. So you withdraw, not out of bitterness, but because your soul is done settling for shallow. You'd rather sit alone in stillness than speak with people who have forgotten how to be present. Now it feels like home. There is a sacredness in the quiet that no conversation can replace, a gentle rhythm in the tick of the clock, the soft rustle of wind through the curtains, the hush of a room filled with nothing but your own breathing. You used to fear being alone. Now you find yourself craving it, because the world outside is loud, too loud. The city never stops. Voices compete for attention, screens flash, news blares, opinions shout over each other like storms with no sky. And amidst it all, your soul whispers, "Enough." You begin to withdraw, not because you're giving up, but because you're tuning in. There's a stillness inside you now that wasn't there before. It didn't arrive suddenly. It grew like a quiet garden, tended through years of pain, love, disappointment, and joy. Now you sit in that garden. You watch the days pass, not with urgency, but with awe. You see things others rush past. The way light dances across the floor in late afternoon. The way your hands, though worn, still move with grace. The way your breath rises and falls like a tide, calm, steady, alive. People may say you've become distant, that you've withdrawn, that you no longer join the noise of gatherings and the rush of outings. But what they don't understand is that peace has become your closest companion. You no longer need to explain yourself. You no longer chase approval, because you've learned that being at peace with yourself is more valuable than being liked by the crowd. There's a kind of joy that doesn't need music to dance, a kind of conversation that doesn't need words, and a kind of presence that is most powerful when unannounced. Stillness isn't emptiness. It's fullness without chaos. It's where you meet your truest self, without masks, without roles. And in that sanctuary of stillness, you are not old. You are not forgotten. You are simply free. You don't remember the moment it happened. There was no switch, no sudden dimming of the light, just a slow fading, like the sunset that disappears before you realize it's gone. You walk into a room now, and sometimes it's as if you were never there. Eyes pass over you. Voices talk around you. Smiles land on others, skip over you like your air. You're not ignored out of malice. No one means to erase you. It's just that somewhere along the way, the world stopped seeing you. It's strange. You once held rooms together. You were the storyteller, the peacemaker, the memory keeper. Now you find yourself holding a cup of tea in your hands at a family gathering, and no one really asks how you are anymore. Not deeply, not truly. You nod, you smile, but inside there's a quiet ache, not of pain but of absence. It's as if you've become the background to other people's stories, present but not central, real but somehow transparent. This is what they never tell you about growing older, that the most piercing loneliness is not being alone, but feeling invisible while surrounded by people. You used to dress with flair, speak with boldness, carry energy into every space. Now, even when you try, wear something bright, speak a little louder, you still feel like you're fading behind the fabric of the moment. It's not just age, it's culture. It's a world that worships speed, novelty, and youth, and forgets the quiet power of experience. But here's what you've begun to understand. Being invisible isn't the same as being powerless. In fact, there's a certain liberation in not being watched. In the shadows, you see things others miss. You notice the tension behind a smile, the hurt behind a joke. You read the room in ways younger hearts can't yet grasp. You are no ghost. You are the walls that hold the room together, the breath between the sentences, the stillness between life's louder moments. You may walk among crowds unnoticed, but that doesn't make you irrelevant, because your value has never depended on applause. It has always lived in the quiet strength of your presence. And if the world has chosen not to see you, then perhaps, just perhaps, that's their loss, not yours. There's a moment in life when solitude no longer feels like loneliness. It feels like an old friend, familiar, gentle, necessary. You realize that in silence, you hear things more clearly. Not just the sounds around you, but the whispers inside your own soul. The noise of the world can be overwhelming. The chatter, the demands, the expectations. But when you step away, even just for a little while, the fog lifts. In this sacred quiet, wisdom begins to bloom. You begin to understand that solitude isn't absence. It's presence with yourself. It's the space where you meet your true thoughts, your raw feelings, free from judgment and distraction. It's where you forgive the past, where you make peace with what you cannot change, where you rediscover your own voice, not the one shaped by others' needs, but the one born from your own heart. Some fear silence because it forces us to face ourselves, but you've learned to welcome it, because in the silence you find strength, not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet, steady power that anchors your being. You begin to see that the world's noise is fleeting, but the wisdom you gain in solitude is lasting. It's here that you reclaim your story, that you remember who you were, who you are, and who you still can be. You don't need crowds or constant connection to feel alive. Your soul dances to a quieter rhythm now, one that moves with the seasons of your life. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always true. And in this rhythm you find peace. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is permission to simply be. Alone, whole, and profoundly free. Saying no is one of the most powerful acts you can embrace in the later chapters of life. It's not about shutting people out. It's about opening the door to yourself. When you say no to noise, no to endless obligations, no to forced smiles, you say yes to your peace. You choose your energy, you guard your time, you honor your limits. Because after decades of giving, of striving, and of caring for others, there comes a sacred moment when caring for yourself becomes the greatest gift. Liberation is not in isolation. It's in the freedom to choose what fills your days. It's the freedom to walk away from what no longer serves you, to release expectations, and to live by your own rhythm. This is not loneliness. It's self-respect. It's understanding that your value is not tied to constant presence or endless activity. It's knowing that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is to simply say no. And in that no, you find your yes to rest, to joy, to moments that truly matter. Your journey is unique. Your wisdom is your compass. And every choice you make is a step toward the peace you deserve. If this story touched your heart, if you see yourself or a loved one in these words, please share your thoughts below. Let's build a community where age is celebrated and silence speaks volumes. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because your story matters, and together we can honor the beauty of growing wiser every day. Thank you for walking this journey with me.